Hey, everybody, and welcome to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. This is Pastor Megan Rohr. Let me move my microphone a little bit closer so you can hear me better. Sorry about that. This is Pastor Megan Rohr, and this is Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. I'm coming to you from Grace Lutheran in San Francisco, www.gracesf.com. We might have some other people pop in with us today, or we might not. I started a little late, and it's my fault, not theirs. Today, our readings for Sunday, which come out of the Great Cycle of the Lectionary, which is a collected group of biblical readings that many mainline churches follow. It's a 3-year cycle so that you get through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then John is like spliced in at fun moments that they think might add to the story. Today's, I just want to talk about the gospel reading, which gospel is just a fancy word that in contemporary times means I'm talking about Jesus, a story about Jesus. So it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the 4 gospels. Literally in the Greek, gospel means good news. It was a pun because the Caesar, or the barbaric ruler of the time, had a newspaper, and the news goings of the politicians was called the good news. And so the idea that Jesus's story is a gospel is one that is supposed to undercut political authority. It's supposed to show you that politicians are not doing what they say they were doing, at least in biblical times. Now, it's so great to have politicians that just take care of all of our needs. Thank you, politicians. Okay. So the idea is that the good news of God, this idea of justice, extends beyond what the political arena might think of justice. Today's scripture reading is an interesting one because if you are someone who believes that every bit or scrap of the Bible fits together in a perfect way that is inerrant, which just means that there's no room for even human error in the writing of the biblical stories, if they are so perfect that you can glue them all together and you'll get the most perfect story on the planet, this story will be a very interesting one for you. It seems more like Jesus was a rabbi who was doing things like telling sermons. And if you took every single one of my sermons and you pasted them together, you would not get something perfect, but you would get stories that are meant to move people to understand things beyond their meanings. And I might use names and ideas in my stories that are going to help you think about things beyond what I'm talking about, or clues, particularly because Jesus lived in a time where the literal consequence for speaking against the political rulers was to be killed. And we know that because that's how his story ends. Then you might tell the story in coded ways at certain points. And so you might use names and phrases and things that make contemporary folk go wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like if I mention baskets of deplorables, you might know that I'm saying something about a controversial Hillary Clinton speech, or I'm saying something about controversial followers of Donald Trump. I can mention basket of deplorables, and the audience who hears me say it can take it in whatever way is theirs to take it, and it might or might not be what I believe or agree with. And so you have to know that there are ways in which Jesus is telling particular stories to the crowd that is assembled. And so when Lutherans like me look at the Bible, we try to suss out the context of it. So who was there? Who was Jesus talking to? What maybe was going on in the news at the time? What was the social economic implications of what's going on? And so here is a good example. In the Lutheran Church, when I first became a pastor almost 10 years ago in 2006, I was ordained extraordinarily. I was ordained outside of the rules of the church because at the time, the church wasn't yet ready to fully welcome gay and lesbian folk as pastors in the church without a set of rules that felt unjust to me. And so I was ordained outside of the rules in a way that I was told by bishops at the time that I would never be deemed as a legit pastor in the Lutheran Church. And times have changed, right? So 10 years later, I'm now a pastor in the Lutheran Church, and the National Lutheran Church lets me help with stuff and gives grants to projects that I'm working on, and has let me into the fold, so to speak, let me into the space. But this idea that someone can go from being an extraordinary pastor to an ordinary pastor is funny to talk about. I'm not saying that I'm like a superhero pastor, even though some people are fans and will believe that, but there is something funny to tell the story about how I moved from being an extraordinary pastor to an ordinary pastor. The context matters in that circumstance. And if you just hear that the Lutheran Church didn't let gay and lesbian people be pastors for a while, you might think that they're wrestling through biblical questions. You might think of that story differently if I tell you it that way than if I tell you it this way. So in 1989, when the Evangelical Lutheran Church was merging from its predecessor church bodies, was about the same time that the AIDS epidemic ravaged our world. And countless people, particularly here in San Francisco, the epicenter of the AIDS crisis, had no idea if even sharing communion with each other meant that they were going to die or get infected with this disease that they had no idea how it spread. At St. Francis Lutheran Church, they changed the way they did communion so that the pastor would always dip the bread last or drink from the cup last, so that if they were going to get infected, that they were all going to get infected together. That's not the choice every pastor would make, but that's how the pastor at St. Francis chose to respond to the AIDS crisis and the fear that was happening. During the same time that the AIDS crisis is ravaging a community, political leaders refuse to acknowledge that it's happening. So Ronald Reagan takes years and years and years and years and years before he'll even acknowledge that the disease is happening, particularly because they thought gay and lesbian people were deplorable. And they were using religious rhetoric to justify allowing people to die of a disease, not treating it, not looking into what the cause is. At that same time that political leaders are ignoring the AIDS crisis, the folk in San Francisco know that because religious rhetoric is being used to speak out against gay and lesbian folk, that you can't just send in the white male heterosexually married minister to do ministry effectively in the midst of this epicenter, because they're not going to be believed, and because the rhetoric of the church is so strong, telling people that they deserve this terrible illness that no one deserves. So St. Francis and First United decided that they would break the rules because there's nothing else they could have done to respond to the AIDS epidemic. People needed pastors, they needed funerals, families needed consolation, people needed folk to be with them in the midst of people lying and saying that God had abandoned them. We know that through our baptism, God doesn't abandon anybody, that no matter what we do, neither death nor life, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come can ever separate us from the love of God. So we know the AIDS crisis can't separate us from the love of God either. But still, during this timing, while people were dying, that's when the policy saying gay and lesbian people can't be pastors was created. So there's an added layer of yuck that goes along with this kind of policy. And there's a layer of yuck that remains, that even though the policy has changed and it's 10 years later, and we now have the ability to be pastors in the church, no one's ever apologized for the timing or the fact that it fed into that anti-gay AIDS rhetoric of the time. There's actually even a letter where Herbert Chillstrom, who was the presiding bishop of the ELCA, sends a letter to Bill Clinton saying, "Don't ask, don't tell works so well in the Lutheran Church. You should try it for the military." I tell you, so do you understand that how you tell the story matters? And if I don't tell you the particular context, it changes the way you hear the story. So Now let's look at this Luke text in the same kind of way. On the surface level, if I just tell you the story that it is the story of a poor homeless person, beggar, who has sores all over their body. They're so weak that dogs lick their sores and they can't even like swat the dogs away. And walking past this poor beggar is a rich person who doesn't help, who doesn't give them food or relief of any kind. And when the poor beggar is in heaven at a seat of honor with Abraham, who no one's going to argue is not a beloved figure of God, the rich person wants something to drink and wants their thirst to be quenched, and they're told, you got your reward. You gluttoned. You took all of it through the abundance that you experienced on earth, and you have forfeited your right to any of the feast to come. So it shares this idea that justice is going to come in the far-fetched future, right? If you don't see justice while you're on earth, if you were killed, or if you are unjustly treated in disproportionate ways on earth, you'll receive that reward in the afterlife, that ultimately justice will happen. Even if you don't see justice happening now, you see people dying in terrible ways that are unjust. Ultimately, in the end, people are going to get what they deserve. So if you can also go deeper into that story in the same way that I told you about the ordination stories in the midst of the AIDS crisis, know that the story is being told to religious leaders who are very wealthy. It's told to religious leaders who are described as being in love with money, although it's coming from the side that's grumpy with them. So you can just take that for what it is. The stereotype around the Pharisees is that they are in love with money, that they're not paying attention to what's really going on in the world, that they're more interested in rules and proper order and ritual in the church than they are about taking care of other human lives. And it's helpful to know that this rich person that's being talked about isn't just your everyday person who, it's not someone who just has a little bit more than the beggar who lives paycheck to paycheck. It's not even someone who owns a bunch of houses or apartment buildings that could give a space for someone to live. The particular rich person in this story has purple and fine linens. And that means they're a king. They're a king, they're a president, they're royalty. So they're not only rich, but they're in charge of the entire broken system of injustice that is keeping this poor person impoverished. So this is a story not about every single time you walk past a homeless person who asks you for money, or drive past someone on the side of the road who has a cardboard sign that says that they need a little help. It's a story about the president of the United States not fixing entire systems of justice. It's a story of a real estate mogul who lives in a house that's full of gold, not helping those who are homeless. You can put whatever modern day spin on it that you want, not endorsing anyone in particular. But the idea is that this is someone who not only has the ability to offer the food that the poor person needs or the health care that the poor person needs, but to change the whole beloved system of injustice and intolerance and racism and all of the things that have added to why Lazarus is at the front steps. And so you have to wonder, is God a God of revenge? Right? So on the one hand, it feels really lovely if we are someone who have experienced injustice in our world to have a God who gives it to all those who have tormented us while we were alive, who writes out the amount of abundance. So if a God creates the entire world and knows there is enough for all people, but there are some people, whether it's 1% or 3% or 10%, that keep more of the resources and make it so that other people don't have access to them intentionally. Then it might feel good if you are not that 1%, 3%, 10%, as long as we're talking about someone else who's getting it over on us. Feels good to know in the end they're going to get it, right? So anyone who died in slavery, their master's going to get it. Anybody who experienced a terrible natural disaster where political leaders didn't prepare or give them enough timing, those political leaders in the end are going to get it. And it feels really good to stop our Bible study right there. God's on your side. Everybody's going to get it in the end. And so that's why you have a lot of people who read the Bible and stop there. So people who have a charming list of rules that are, if you follow these rules, great things are going to happen to you. And all the people who look like they're having fun are going to get it later. So have no fun in the world, because later you're going to get to have all the fun and they're going to get to have none of the fun. You could stop the story right there. But that's not really all that there is in this story. So this is the only parable in Jesus's parables where anyone has a name. So the poor person in this story is named Lazarus. And that's important because Lazarus is someone who appears in other gospel texts. It's someone who is beloved to Jesus. Perhaps it's the brother of Mary and Martha. Perhaps some people argue it's the beloved disciple that Jesus talks about. In other gospels, there are stories that blame Jesus for Lazarus' death, because if Jesus can heal people and he doesn't come and heal Lazarus soon enough, and then he dies, then it's Jesus's fault, right? That's the idea. If you have protease inhibitors and you refuse to give them to people in the middle of the AIDS crisis, you are to blame for their death. And so this is a story, perhaps, where Jesus has been blamed for Lazarus dying, that because he couldn't get there fast enough or soon enough, or because he didn't want to, or he didn't think he should, or he didn't think it was his job. We don't know what the motivation was that made it so that Jesus didn't get there soon enough. This could be Jesus's counter argument to the people who say, you killed Lazarus. And instead of saying, I know you are, but what am I? Like a politician, Jesus actually says, there is a whole system that has participated in Lazarus' death. So if you are someone who believes in the intersections of justice, like the idea that poverty compounded with racism, compounded with sexism, compounded with homophobia, adds up to a more difficult life for people, this is a great parable for you. This is a multi-layered parable. Perhaps Lazarus is the beloved disciple. Perhaps Lazarus is a part of a family where his sisters seem to be getting the work done. Perhaps Lazarus, like spaces that you might have visited where there are people who beg in front of religious spaces, was a professional beggar. If when I traveled to Mexico City, there were people who literally were bleeding. They had sores on their body that they would pick and ensure that they were bleeding every day, or people who had disabilities who wouldn't get the help or the treatment that they needed so that they could panhandle, so that they could get funds from tourists or from religious folk who were pilgrimaging. I believe people should get healthcare. I believe that people should have the ability to choose if they want to work a typical job with hours and time cards, or if they want to work in the field of compassion, stirring up the hearts of people. I don't think panhandling is a terrible thing for people to do. I think it's hard to tell the difference between a person who is begging for their meal versus begging for a fundraiser for a political campaign. In fact, perhaps the person who's begging for their meal is a bit more in need of the fundraiser. Having said all of that, I don't think people should live in a state of houselessness or without health care just so that we can fulfill a religious obligation to take care of people. And in fact, Martin Luther is thought to be one of the inventors of the welfare system because he thought the idea that we need poor people to be able to give tithes to, which is something that Christians often do during the season of Lent. This idea that doing good deeds for other people helps us be better in God's eyes is not fair to the people who have to live in poverty so that we can do good deeds for them. Martin Luther believed it was the civil authorities' job to give everyone an even playing field, an even ability to have health care, an even ability to have their daily bread, an even ability to get care and love and have the Maslow hierarchy of needs in their life. So how do we end with this? The idea is that on one layer, it's saying, if the only way you read the story is to know that those who have screwed you over in life are going to get it in the end, and that makes you relate to God, fine. That's one way you can read this text, and that's not wrong. It's just one way to relate to God. The next way you can think about this text is think about sin as untangling all of the intersectioned ways that our society is screwing people over. A completely fair way to read this is that capitalism and the idea that some should have and some should have not is not within God's plan or God's order. Or perhaps the way to read this is that religious folk are better than politicians. You can read this in so many different layered ways. A couple of resources that I think might be helpful if you are someone who likes these issues is I recently read Russell Brand's Revolution. I think it's a fascinating book. It's a lot more faithful than you think it will be. The warning and the caveat is that Russell Brand uses a lot of language that your grandma might or might not want you to say out loud. So know that there's some sexually explicit language, there's some F words, but if you are looking for a text that helps you wrestle with the religions of the world in a way that is not unkind and in a way that is maybe more accurate about what Jesus was up to than some of the lists and rules that you might find from fearmongers, it's a interesting read. Russell Brand advocates that those with money have an obligation to give away their money. And he has even a list of steps in how that revolution can happen. For him, it begins with rich people no longer being able to have security guards, because if you can't protect yourself in a gated community as the purple wearing person in our story would, it's harder to get away with those kinds of activities. Another book that I have been reading lately is The Complete Works of Bayard Rustin, and I'll include links to both down here if you are on the blogspot at justlutheran.blogspot.com. And Bayard Rustin talks about poverty and the issues that are happening in the civil rights movement. And Bayard talks a lot about how crime happens in impoverished areas, in part out of necessity and out of needs-based experiences. But he also talks about how the biggest poverty that is plaguing us as a society is the poverty of imagination. And that's the idea that if you can't imagine people of a certain skin tone or people of a certain gender being the president or being skilled workers or presidents of companies. And you can only imagine them as thugs or as dangers. And a lot of what he's talking about are things that are still happening today. So conflicts with the police officers. There's a great conversation between him and Malcolm X about whether or not the struggle should be nonviolent or it should be violent. And learning the particular context and the ways that people have lived their lives has a lot to say about how they want to heal the world in the future. Malcolm X had a very difficult childhood. His father was torn in half by a trolley car, and he was told by the police that it was suicide, although it looked more like an accident. He had encounter after encounter with injustice that seemed insolvable, and there is no way you could have had the early formative years that Malcolm X had and not be so angry that violence is the logical option. Bayard Rustin, on the other hand, was a part of the nonviolent community forever. He's credited with teaching nonviolence to Martin Luther King Jr. And if you've ever seen the film Brother Outsider, you know that there were critical moments when the FBI was blackmailing Martin Luther King Jr. and threatening to use the fact that Bayard Rustin was a gay man to try to undercut the work of the civil rights movement. I share these stories not to kind of burst bubbles or make you wonder about particular people in history, but because I think the more that we know that our civil rights heroes are human, I mean, the more we know that the ways that they were raised and that their parents were attached to them or not attached to them, and how they had experiences in the world, the adversities that they climbed through, their humanness means that our ability to be just is possible too. If we just only imagine Bayard Rustin and Martin Luther King Jr. as people who are perfect and unflawed, then we can't replicate some of the things that they are advocating. So Jesus, again, is accused of killing Lazarus. He's accused of not getting there in time. It's not the only time in the scriptures that he's accused of not using his healing powers soon enough or of letting someone pass away. Lazarus is someone that Jesus loved. And yet Jesus can share that feeling that you might have sometimes of why didn't God help and intervene and get there soon enough for my loved one, or answer the deep held prayers that I fervently prayed that didn't get answered? And why doesn't justice come to those who are faithful but still living in poverty? If there is any consolation in knowing that God has heard that complaint to his face in the form of Jesus, know that that's the case. Know that God is also longing for people to get it in the end sometimes, even if revenge isn't ultimately the highest form of following God. Jesus has his moments. We have our moments. And this parable is one that is poking us like a sleeping bear, poking us to wake up and to care again, to be grumpy, to be mad, to shout from the rooftops that Black Lives Matter, to go to police stations, to be a part of trainings, to support those who are unjustly accused, whatever side of an issue they're on. And so to stand with the police if they're unjustly accused, to force our political leaders to be present, to take care of poverty issues, to ensure that there is healthcare for all, to keep praying, and to be people who continuously long for life to come in the deadest, darkest moments, to hold light for those who can't, to look for hope when it seems impossible, and even in the midst of the most terrible terror, to be people who know that humans have amazing potential even when we choose not to use it, to love more than people deserve, and to seek justice above all. And it's hard. And so, if you are someone who needs to weep, weep. If you are someone who needs to get angry, get angry. If you are someone who needs to take a step back from the systems that you are a part of so that you can hear the stories of those who struggle and those who are vulnerable, then take a pause. This is a parable rich and diverse and full of context that can change the way we see things, with the hope that we will never get stuck with one right answer or read the text the same way every time. That each time we find ourselves in a new space, that we can read these texts anew. And that's why it's alive, and that's why it's good news, because it's good news when you feel like the person in the purple robes. It's good news when you are Lazarus. It is good news when you feel falsely accused like Jesus. It's good news wherever you find yourself in your community. And my hope is that we will be people who do the best we can, because it's all we can do. Don't be mad about what you didn't know when you were a teenager and dumb things that you said. Do the best you can today and tomorrow and going forward. Encourage those around you to do the best they can. And when we don't know what to do, let's gather together, perhaps on Sundays, perhaps in a church, singing hymns, thanking God, and yearning for that day of justice. Thanks, everybody, for stopping by and for listening to Bible Study That Doesn't Suck. We'll be back on next week, and hopefully I'll get my act together and be on time so that the other pastors can join us. Take care, everybody.